Welcome back. We are on page 57, and we are looking at the topic of Islam, very controversial in our world today. And this is a cartoon that originated from my part of the country. After 9/11 happened, someone came up with this cartoon, and we kind of related to it in northern Idaho, where we have all the loggers in the trees. And this guy says, I was driving through a hunting camp. They said, who are you? I hollered, I've been logging. They thought I said, I'm bin Laden, and that's when all the shooting started. The guy's all shot up, and his truck shot up. Well, we know, unfortunately, that Osama bin Laden is a sworn enemy of the United States of America. On February 3rd, 1998, Osama bin Laden called for a holy war against the United States. He included three reasons. He said, number one, it was because of the U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War. You remember the Gulf War back in the early 1990s? He didn't like the fact that the United States had military forces in Saudi Arabia before that war, and he liked it even less that there were some that were allowed to remain there after that war. And then number two, because of the U.S. involvement to prevent a Palestinian buildup. And number three, because of the U.S. support of Israel. Those are three primary reasons that Osama bin Laden called for a holy war against the United States. Now, when he called for a holy war, it was in a convention, if you will, of terrorist organizations. Strangely enough, sometimes the terrorist organizations actually have conventions. It's kind of like we go to a Christian convention, except their conventions are about how to blow people up, how to kill people, how to get the West, how to get the United States. And in his World Front Statement, World Islamic Front Statement, this is an excerpt from it, he said, we with God's, meaning Allah's help, call on every Muslim who believes in God and wishes to be rewarded to comply with God's order to kill the Americans and plunder their money wherever and whenever they find it. We also call on Muslim leaders, youths, and soldiers to launch the raid on Satan's U.S. troops and the devil's supporters along with them, and to displace those who are behind them so that they may learn a lesson. Notice that he employs the name of God in order to exhort people to get involved in his cause. Now, when you remember September 11th, 2001, how many of you actually saw, I wonder, just that are listening to this through the various medium, you probably remember where you were at when you heard the news that terrorists had taken airplanes and crashed them into the World Trade Center. I was at my home. I was getting ready to go to the church, and I was supposed to have a business meeting with a children's home down on the border of Texas and Mexico that we support, and that some of the elders of our church went out, and they are now the directors of that. And I had to call that off. We canceled our Christian school. It only went half day. We lowered the flag to half-mast. And our church, like many other churches, took on the role of prayer and raising money for Red Cross and doing things of that nature to try and react responsibly to the terror and the barbarous act that was performed. But speaking of that morning, you remember September 11, 2001. At 8:45 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 out of Boston, Massachusetts, crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center with 92 people on board. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower with a total of 65 passengers and crew. At 9:43 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 carrying 64 people crashed into the Pentagon. One side collapsed. At 10:05 a.m., the World Trade Center South Tower collapsed. At 10:10 a.m., the United Airlines Flight 93 crashed in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, killing 45. We know now that they were heroes, that they actually crashed the plane into the ground. It was supposed to circle around and most likely try to take out the Capitol or the White House. And then at 10:28 a.m., the World Trade Center North Tower collapsed. Then there was war against terrorism. And President Bush and the United States basically went to war against terrorist groups, terrorist regimes, against the Taliban in Afghanistan, and then against Saddam Hussein, the president or the dictator of Iraq. And we're still kind of in that, coming out of the other side of that, hopefully. But during those years, we have been in the midst of a great struggle with terrorist groups, terrorist regimes, and we've seen a lot taking place. Now, before I get to the size and the strength of modern Islam, I would like to take a moment and focus your attention at the top of page 57 on this testimony from William Miller. And I think this speaks of the kind of heart that we should have as Christians towards those that are in Islam or those that are caught up in non-Christian religions. Quote, "It was Mr. Wilson's tears that led me to become a Christian," says Abbas Abari. Abbas was a Muslim cleric in the town of Damgan when the Reverend Ivan Wilson, a missionary in Tehran, came to this little town and began to distribute Christian literature and talk with people about Christ. Abbas came one night to call on him. His purpose was not to become a Christian or even to learn what the Christian teaching is, but to demonstrate the superiority of Islam to Christianity and to humiliate the missionary. Mr. Wilson talked kindly to the Muslim caller and explained the doctrines of the Bible to him. But Abbas made the usual response. No, Jesus was not God's son. He did not die on the cross, and he foretold the coming of Muhammad. Also, the Christian scriptures have been corrupted, and Christians worship three gods. The missionary patiently tried to explain the misunderstandings and answer the arguments of the Muslim, but all to no avail. Abbas began to feel very proud of himself that he had defeated the Christian teacher in argument when he saw a strange sight. The missionary began to weep. Now, years later, in an interview with Abbas, he said this, "Mr. Wilson came here, he talked with me and argued with me, but I felt I had overcome him, and I was feeling very proud of myself. Then that man of God felt so sorry for me in my unbelief and pride that he began to weep. His tears did for me what his arguments did not do. They melted my heart, and I believed and became a Christian. Later, I was baptized." You know, sometimes we can witness, we find ourselves in situations and circumstances where we have done the best we can do, but there's just something about it that we have to remember. It's not just our arguments or our convincing that makes the difference. It's the Spirit of the living God and people seeing that Spirit living in our lives and responding to who they are that really often has the key that unlocks the door of their hearts. And that's what happened in this situation. Now, when we look at the size and strength of modern Islam today, you can see all of the black on the globe there. Those are places where Islam has great strength today. They dominate those cultures. There are approximately 1.3 billion Muslims in the world, between 1.2 or 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. Most people would say that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. And if you look at it overall, that is true. Much of that, however, is because they have a lot of children. And so the growth is because they are prolific. They have a lot of kids. If you look at if you dissect Christianity, you'll find that the charismatic church in the third world countries is actually growing faster than even Islam is growing in the world today. But that's just looking at one specific part of Christianity. There are between 85 to 90% of the Muslims that are Sunnis. So the largest part are Sunni, are called Sunnites. 10 to 15% are Shiites, and there's a marginal group called Sufis. These are the three main groups of the Muslim world: the Sunni, the Shiites, and the Sufis. Now, the Sunni and the Shiites and the Sufis have variations. They have differences. I talk about it in the chapter in the book on Islam. One of the key differences is that the Sunnis believe that they have the right to kind of decide who's going to be their leader. However, with the Shiites, they believe that their leader needs to be a direct descendant of Muhammad, or as close of a descendant as they can possibly get from him. And so leadership is an issue. They also have some doctrinal differences. And then the Sufis are actually more of the mystics of Islam. Some of them are truth seekers. You'll find them being quite different than the other two groups. There are approximately 5 million Muslims in the United States. And some of those are first generation. We also have second and third generation. Perhaps half of them are second or third generation Muslims, growing up and being patriotic, believing in the red, white, and blue, and fighting in our military forces. And so they are very much a part of this country. There are about 5 million Muslims in France today. As a matter of fact, some would say that there's more Muslims in France than there are Catholics that are active in their faith. There are 7 million in Germany, 7 million Muslims in Germany. And in England, it's considered that there's between 1 to 2 million. There's over 50 countries that are dominated by Islam today. And when you look at the radicals, we see that possibly as many as 100,000 Muslim radicals were trained in Afghanistan and Pakistan camps in the 1980s and 1990s. Now, we're talking about people that were trained in specific warfare, how to blow things up. And that's just in those training camps in Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's not all of the camps that existed in Africa or other parts of the world, in Asia, for instance. And so there are a lot of terrorist groups out there. One startling thing happened in the mid-1990s, whereas the Sunni and the Shiites were opposed to one another before this time, now they started cooperating together, the terrorist groups. The Sunni and Shiite terrorist groups started cooperating together because they had a common enemy, the West and the United States. Now, the modern controversy, right after 9/11, many questions started rising, and 3 of them kind of stand out that I want to address here today. One thing, or one question that arose from the 9/11 was, are the terrorists true Muslims? Right after 9/11, we saw ulema teachers, various Muslims standing up in this country, mullahs and different people in various positions saying these terrorists were not true Muslims. This is not Islam. And so suddenly America was caught in this big question, like, okay, are these terrorists really Muslims? Or is all of Islam like this or not? So this question arose. Another one was, is Islam really peaceful or is Islam really violent? Is Islam peaceful or is it violent? And finally, do Muslims worship the same God as the Christians and the Jews? Much has been spoken about this. Many rising up and saying, oh, we all worship the same God. Can't we all get along? We all worship the same God, that Allah is just another name for our God. So these three questions became significant in our modern view of Islam. Are the terrorists true Muslims? Is Islam peaceful or violent? Do Muslims worship the same God as the Christians and the Jews? Now, the top of page 58, looking at the early history of Islam. It started with Muhammad. He was a 6th century Arab Bedouin of the Quraysh tribe, and he supposedly descended from Ishmael. Nobody knows for sure, but he supposedly descended from Ishmael. And so my statement is, who was Ishmael? And it is answered here in letter A. Ishmael. In Genesis 16, the story is told of Abram and Sarai, his wife. This is before their names were changed. Sarai felt bad because she was barren. She told her husband to take her servant Hagar and conceive a son through her, as was the custom in those days when a woman was barren. Abraham did as Sarai requested, and Hagar conceived a son when Abram was 86. Sarai and Hagar had great difficulties with each other at this time. Hagar fled from Sarai's jealousy, and she cried in the wilderness. God heard her. He told her to return to Sarai and submit to her authority. He also told Hagar to name her son Ishmael. God will hear, and that his descendants would be too many to count. She received a prophecy regarding Ishmael's character and then returned to Sarai and Abraham. Now we see in Genesis 16:12 an ancient prophecy regarding Ishmael. It says, O Ishmael, the Lord said, he shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of his brethren. Now, interestingly enough, this word wild is used 9 or 10 times in the Old Testament, and every other time that it's used, it refers to a wild donkey. Only once does it refer to a man, and it's with Ishmael here. Strangely enough, this is the same kind of spirit that we see that was born inside of Ishmael, that eventually we see rise up in the life of Muhammad, and indeed is a part of Islam today. Another prophecy in Genesis 17:20 through 21, and as for Ishmael, remember that Abraham wanted God to accept Ishmael because he was, at that point in time, he wasn't quite sure this whole thing of Isaac. God had been promising him that he would father a child, but it hadn't happened yet, not with Sarah. And so he was proposing to the Lord, well, what about Ishmael? Can't he be my descendant? And this is God's response. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year. Now, the Muslims have kind of changed this part of the story of Genesis to reflect their views, that I believe it is that Ishmael actually was the one who got the blessing. But we know that's not the way that the Bible truly was stated. And we see under number 3 there in your notes, Genesis 25:13 through 18. And it talks about Ishmael's sons becoming the 12 princes who prosper to the east of Egypt. And very interestingly, that is where we see that Saudi Arabia is at today, to the east there. And then number 4, Ishmael's descendants, they became known as Ishmaelites and Midianites. These are the ones that bought Joseph and sold him to the Egyptian Potiphar. We find this in Genesis 37:28, 37:36, and Genesis 39:1. They became enemies of Israel. We can see this at least in one place in Psalm 83:6, as well as other places in the Old Testament. And eventually, the historian Josephus called them an Arabian nation. That's what goes in the blank in the midst of that number 4 there, Arabian nation. Today, Arabs are a composite of various people groups, but some descend from Ishmael, thus Abraham. Now, you cannot say anymore that all Arabs that are in Arabia were, descended from Ishmael, because other people groups have moved into that part of the country. And so really, and you can't even say that all Arabs are Muslims. As a matter of fact, I believe it's Arabs only comprise maybe 1/3 or even 1/4 of all Muslims today. Actually, the largest grouping of Muslims is in Indonesia. And we'll talk about that more later, but there's some things that we need to understand. Okay, now Muhammad's life, it was from AD 570 to 632, but during that time, I just kind of want to give you a little bit of a background of where it's at. You can see the peninsula of Saudi Arabia there, and there were constant wars between the Bedouin tribes. He grew up in a warfare atmosphere. There was always tribes that were stealing, or Bedouin groups that were stealing from others. The caravans they would rob towns. It was kind of the way, the culture that they grew up in. It was the beginning of cities in the Arabian Peninsula. Like, for instance, the Medina that is here, that Muhammad eventually went to rule over. It only had 70 families in the town. And so it was just the beginning of urbanization. It wasn't very big. Mecca was larger, but it was still not like what we would consider today. And then there was great polytheism. In Mecca, in the temple itself, there were 360 idols that were set up. And the Bedouin tribes had various idols that they would worship. It just so happened that the Quraysh tribe that Muhammad belonged to worshipped the moon deity called Allah. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Let's look at Muhammad's personal life here now. In 570, he was born in Mecca. So write the word Mecca on the blank there under letter B at the bottom of page 58. In 576, his mother died when he was only 6 years old. His father had already died, so he became an orphan. When he was 25, he married Khadijah, and he began to run her fruit business. And he would drive her camels and go between Mecca and Medina delivering fruit, basically. In 610, when he was 40 years old, he supposedly had the first revelation in a cave on Mount Hira, Hira. And supposedly this was Gabriel that presented himself to Muhammad and told him revelation. Now, of course, he thought that he was demon possessed. And he went and tried to tell his wife, but she convinced him that he was not demon possessed, but that this was a vision from God and that he should listen to it. Actually, from the time he was a little boy, he had epileptic seizures. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And these seizures would come, and he thought that he was dealing with devil possession during those times. In 622, 12 years after the first revelation, he had a formidable gathering. At first it was by his family, and then some of his tribe started to follow him. Eventually, he was asked to lead the town of Medina, and so he moved to Medina to lead the town. And war broke out between Medina and Mecca. And there were 3 great battles. The first battle, Muhammad's troops won. The second battle, they lost, and he almost died. He got stabbed in the mouth with a sword. And then the third battle, he won. He was victorious, and he took 10,000 troops and marched into Mecca. And Mecca pretty much laid down their arms. They surrendered before him. He went in and killed a few people, but most were left alive. He went in and destroyed all of the idols, with the exception of the one to Allah. And so he conquered Mecca in 630, and then just 2 short years later, Muhammad died, and the first caliph was elected Abu Bakr. And from that time on, there was actually civil war inside of Islam for a while they were trying to figure out who was going to be in the leadership. And then you see the splitting of the Shiites and the Sunnis early on in their history. Now, the name of Allah is a composite of sorts. Most people don't realize this, but the word Allah is actually the word for the God. And so when they say Allah, it's their word for God. That's the word that they have. It means the God. As I mentioned before, Allah was the moon deity of Muhammad's tribe. It's the one that they worshipped. Actually, Muhammad's grandfather was the priest of Allah. And when Muhammad was young, after his mother died, his grandfather took him in for a couple of years, and so he got to kind of know how his grandfather did things, how his grandfather worshipped Allah. Even though there were 360 gods, Allah was the head of the Arab pantheon of gods. He was a moon deity. Now, in those cultures, in those days, a lot of the head gods were sun gods, but not in that culture. The head god was a moon deity. The word Allah is also possibly a distorted form of the ancient Aramaic. For instance, Elah is used by Daniel and Ezra. We see that in the books of Daniel and Ezra. But in those books, they are referring to a god. They understood that the name of God proper in the Old Testament is Yahweh, or as our derivative is Jehovah. And you never see Abraham giving credence to Allah. He was always talking about Yahweh. And so really their connection between, their Allah and our God is very weak at best. At this time, there were various other Bedouin concepts that were attached to the idea of Allah that Muhammad embraced, including this one, Al-Rahman, which means the merciful. You hear Muslims saying Allah the merciful. That came from actually another god that was called Al-Rahman, but his attribute became attached to the idea of Allah, and so now it's Allah the merciful. Now, Muhammad had personal problems. Under letter D on page 59, in Muhammad's culture, he became like a warrior king. His followers overlooked numerous personal and character problems, thinking that their God, Allah, was using him anyway. Some examples of personal problems and character issues. He had seizures. From the time he was a little boy, he had seizures. Now, this isn't a character issue in any sense, but because of these seizures, he believed that he was demon possessed, and he dealt with this at different times in his life. His wives, he had at least 16 wives. He had 4 mistresses and 2 slaves. Now, can anybody in the class here tell me why this was a character problem? It was a character problem because he only allowed his followers to have 4 wives. So he basically said in the Quran that they could have 4 wives. This was supposedly a revelation from God, but he took at least 16 wives, had 4 mistresses and 2 slaves. And one of the slaves was a Christian named Mary. And she refused to marry him, to wed him, and therefore she had to remain a slave of his her entire life. Betrayal. He tricked the Jews. Now, at times, when he was trying to get the Jews to follow him, he would come across to them as a prophet. And when he was trying to get the Christians to follow him, he would come across to them as an apostle. And because he was trying to get these people to forget their religion and to embrace the religion he was creating. But even though they wouldn't follow him, for a while in life, he was kind of okay with them. He didn't want any problems with them. It was kind of a political maneuver because they were more powerful than he was. And so as we get into the Quran, you'll see that there's both peaceful things spoken about the Jews and the Christians and then violent things spoken about them. Well, while he was trying to win them, he was peaceful towards them. But when he got into power, suddenly he turned on the Jews. And he actually had, I believe it was 700 Jews beheaded in one day. Just all the men taken out. And he betrayed them because these were the folks of Medina that had supported him in the first place. He was caught lying because he sent out raiders during a truce and then he lied about it. Instead of taking the blame himself, he shoveled off the blame onto one of his lieutenants, so to speak, that actually carried out the raid. His motives. Well, he influenced his adopted son Zayd to divorce. And then Muhammad quickly married Zayd's ex named Zainab. And he actually was enticed by her, he was drawn to her, and vice versa. And so they plotted this thing. And his adopted son divorced Zayd, or Zainab, and then Muhammad quickly married her. So his motives were dubious. We see that he was guilty of murder. He ordered the thousands butchered and killed with his own hand. If Muhammad was a prophet, he was definitely a bloody prophet. And regarding theft, he stole large booty from caravans. He had no problem with stealing. Now that was a part of the day in which he lived, the culture, but he did steal large booty from caravans. And finally, he had self-centered revelations in the Quran. They were for personal gain, self-centered revelations. Let's talk about the development of the Quran for a second, and then we'll look at some of those revelations. The revelations were supposedly given by Allah through Gabriel, the angel. And so when Muhammad would speak, if you've never read the Quran, it's really a strange read because it is like this personal dialogue between Muhammad and Allah through the angel Gabriel. And it's just kind of talking back and forth, supposedly. There are 114 surahs or chapters, and they are confusing. One of the reasons they're confusing is because they are not sequenced properly. And that even upsets some of the Muslim scholars because the people that put together the Quran after Muhammad died did not sequence the surah chapters based upon when they happened. They broke them up in different parts of his life. And so it comes across very confusing. There's much promotion of Muhammad himself as a greater than Jesus or any other in the Quran. And of course, to Muhammad, Jesus was simply one of many prophets that came in the history of the world. But to Muhammad, he was the greatest prophet that God or Allah had ever sent. There is rationalization of Islam over Judaism and Christianity. Although it recognizes both Judaism and Christianity, there is a great rationalization inside of the Quran over those two religions. Within the Quran, we see the pillars of modern Islamic faith and practice. The revelations are given that justify Muhammad's murders, revenge, ambushes, looting, lust, and excess. Now let's look at some examples. Here's an example of a revelation for personal gain. Okay, this is written in Surah 33:4. And by the way, if you compare one Quran to another, chances are it's going to look differently because they don't number their individual verses like 1 through 10. They group them 10 at a time, and it's very confusing as to what verse is what, so that even they have a hard time with it at times, depending on the Quran that is being read. But notice this one. This is an example of revelation for personal gain. Now, this is supposedly God talking to the people through Muhammad. Compare this to Jesus, okay? If you'd ever think that Jesus would say anything like this. He says, "O believers, enter not into the houses of the prophet, save by his leave, for a meal without waiting his time. When you are invited, then enter. And when you have eaten, then disperse at once. And engage not in familiar talk, for this would cause the prophet trouble." Basically, what was happening is that too many people were showing up to his house and wanting a free supper. And so he eventually came up with this revelation and said, wait a minute, if you're going to come here and eat and then leave, and don't engage in a lot of familiar talk, because this is causing me problems. Here's an example of revelation for sexual gain. I already explained this a little bit, but here's the one where he caused his son-in-law to divorce. And it says, "And when Zaid had settled concerning her to divorce her, Zenab, we," meaning Allah, "married her to thee, that it might not be a crime in the faithful to marry the wives of their adopted sons, when they have settled the affair concerning them, and the command of God is to be performed. No blame attaches to the prophet where God hath given him permission." So in other words, see, even in their culture, it's against the law for a family member to divorce and then to marry another family member, even in their culture. But all of a sudden, because of this revelation, it was okay in Muhammad's situation. And no blame was to be attached to him because God gave him permission, don't you know? An example of revelation for political gain. Now, let me give some background of this. Muhammad was trying to gain the following of his tribe, the Quraysh. His tribe, the Quraysh, worshipped Allah, as has been mentioned, but they also worshipped Allah's daughters. And Allah had 3 daughters. And Muhammad came along and said, no, we're only supposed to worship Allah. Well, this pleased many other people, but it didn't please some of the people in his own tribe. And so this was like a political maneuver. And they were coming to him, his own tribe, and saying, listen, we want to worship the daughters, the goddesses of Allah. And in order to gain their following, Muhammad supposedly received a revelation from God saying it was okay to do this. These became known as the Satanic verses. And that it was okay to worship these. And here's what they are when you read them the way they were originally. It was this: did you consider Alat and Al-Uzza and Al-Manat, the third, the other? These are the daughters of Allah. Those are the swans exalted. Their intercession is expected. So there's worship right there. Their likes are not to be neglected. Now, what happened after this was spoken is that a big chaos happened in the camp. And those who had heard Muhammad say that they were only supposed to worship Allah came to him and said, wait a minute, what's going on here? Is this like a political maneuver, whatever? The words are lost, but basically there was some type of tumult, and he backed down. And so he took out these ones where you see the blue. They actually went out of the revelation. And so they are no longer a part of the Quran today. Only the part that is in the yellow up above there is what's left. However, this caused great chaos in the camp, and what was whispered around the camp was, well, did the devil slip a revelation into Muhammad? And he messed up? And then they started thinking, well, if the devil slipped one revelation into Muhammad and he messed up, then what about all the other ones? So this became hugely controversial, and they don't even like to talk about it today. Now, the story of Muhammad is revealed by modern scientific and medical research to be a gross fraud. This is what this guy wrote. I'm sorry, I should have said this is a medical doctor, a converted Muslim, I believe he is. He lives in the Middle East. His name is Deet Korkut, and he is a specialist of epilepsy. And very interesting book, Life Alert, The Medical Case of Muhammad. And he writes this in his book, very insightful. He says, the story of Muhammad is revealed by modern scientific and medical research to be a gross fraud. The pretension that Muhammad was a prophet is just pretension. He was rather an evil epileptic. He goes on, the pretension that the foolish Quran, that's what he calls it, is in any way a revelation from the Almighty Creator has been shown to be nonsense. It is only the production of a defective brain. Whoa, that's pretty heavy. Now looking at the bottom of page 59, Biblical Insight, False Gospel Messenger. Galatians 1, 8 through 12 puts it this way. But even if we, get this, or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. This is Paul writing to the Galatians. It goes on, as we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you, then what you have received, let him be accursed. For now do I persuade men or God, or do I seek to please men? For if I still pleased men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. The power in this statement is that even if an angel comes and speaks any other gospel than what has been spoken to us, then that entity is to be accursed. That's what we see happening in Mormonism, that it was angels of light that came. And many of the other cults that have started in the world, including this one right here, although this has become a major world religion. Now, speaking of the pillars of Islam, I want you to understand the words. This part right here is not in your notes. You can write this down if you want. The word Islam means submission. You'll also find this at the beginning of your chapter on Islam. The word Islam means submission, and the word Muslim means one who is submitted. So the word Islam means submission, and the word Muslim means one who is submitted. So you can see kind of how they work together. You got, and that's think about it. Christianity is those that follow Christ. That's what the word means, those that follow Christ. But when you think of Islam, it's all about submission, obedience, because their whole thing is to obey Allah but not to know Him. And so the word Islam means submission, and the word Muslim means one who is submitted. Now, the pillars of modern Islam, you don't have to write these down right now. They're actually in your notes. But it is to recite the Shahada, which we'll look at in a minute, to pray, which is called Salat, to give alms, which is called Zakat, to fast during Ramadan, this is called the Psalm, to make pilgrimage to Mecca, this is called the Hajj. And then many add to this to make a holy jihad as a sixth pillar, to make a holy jihad. Now let's look at these. The Shahada, under number 1 there, at the top of page 60, the Shahada, this is their creed. They speak this: there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. They have this whispered into their ear when they are born. They speak it throughout their lives every single day. They say it in their prayer times. They say it at other times when they are confronted with other truth. It's almost like a hypnotic thing that there is brainwashing, if you will. Hitler said if you say a lie loud enough and long enough, people will believe it. And so these poor people are told over and over again that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. It's usually the last thing they say before they die. It's called the Shahada. It is the shortest creed in the world, and certainly one of the most powerful. The Salat, you can see their forms of prayer, their kneelings. They actually use prayer beads as well. And didn't bring those with me, but kind of like, see, they got some of their stuff from Christianity, they got some of their stuff from Judaism, and so they incorporated the Catholics' prayer beads, basically, and so that became a part of their prayer ritual. Now, in this prayer format, it symbolizes the 5 steps of Muhammad on the night of his ascent into the 7 heavens. Prayers are performed 5 times a day at dawn, noon, mid-afternoon, dusk, and 2 hours after sunset. Now, interestingly enough, follow this, because what happened was on some night, supposedly, Muhammad had this dream. And in this dream, he ventured to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem. And he stood on what is now the Dome of the Rock. He stood on that, supposedly in his dream, and he ascended into heaven. Gabriel led him into heaven. And this supposedly, this ritual format actually symbolizes that ascent into heaven. That's why at that Dome of the Rock we see mosques around it, we see synagogues around it, because supposedly to them, one of their myths anyway, is that is where God stood when he created all of creation, on that rock. And some Christians, we see churches there, some Christians think that maybe that's where Jesus stood when he ascended into heaven. So that's some of the most amazing real estate in the whole world right there, and controversial, that these 3 major religions all want a piece of. Now, the zakat is to give 2.5% to the poor monthly. The psalm is to fast from sunup to sundown during Ramadan. And they do this once a year during Ramadan. And notice the zakat. I mean, they do give to the poor. There is some mercy there. They actually do reach out to the poor. They don't give necessarily 10% to the church, but there is some mercy there to the poor. This is the Hajj, which now this is the temple in Mecca. And every year you'll see 2 million Muslims come here, and they're all dressed in white. And right there in the center, you see what's called the Kaaba. And that's where the black asteroid that represents Allah, they figure it's a meteor or an asteroid that fell to the earth. And that's the stone, the black stone, it's embedded in the side of that. And they just want to get a sight of this thing, or if they can possibly touch it or kiss it. But these 2 million Muslims will come, they'll dress in white because they don't want to have any kind of social distinction, economic distinction. And they are supposed to travel to Mecca once in their life, to the Holy Land of Islam, to worship Allah there. And then there is the jihad. There's the greater and the lesser. Now, jihad literally means efforts on God's path, but it is roughly translated as holy war. Efforts on God's path, but it is roughly translated holy war. Now, notice that there is a greater and a lesser jihad. The greater jihad is this: an inner struggle to bring one closer to Allah. An inner struggle to bring one closer to Allah. That kind of sounds like Christianity in a sense, struggling in the spirit, to bring ourselves closer to God. There's kind of a noble purpose behind the greater jihad. However, notice the lesser jihad. It is the militant jihad against the infidel. And guess who the infidel are? Often in the Quran, the infidel are the Jews and the Christians who resist expansion of Islam or who pose a threat against it. So you have the jihad, which literally means efforts on God's path, but it is roughly translated as holy war. You have the greater and lesser jihad. The greater jihad meaning inner struggle to bring one close to Allah. But then you have the lesser jihad, which is a militant jihad against the infidel. And sometimes that happens in society too. They want to have Islam in dominance. Now, after 9/11, many of the Islamic teachers stood up and said, the jihad is not violent, it's not militant. Well, that's only partially true. That's kind of a deceptive statement, because that's only speaking of the greater jihad. But many Muslims embrace the lesser jihad, understanding that there is times of militant jihad against the infidel. We will talk more about this in the next session. Let's take a break now.